Okay, good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Again, welcome to the Washington Policy Pulse. I'm Nathan Dean. I'm a senior policy analyst here in Washington. We've got a lot of stuff going on this week, and I think let's start with the news that came from Switzerland over the weekend, and that is Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's negotiations with the Chinese representatives when it comes to our tariffs. Now, going into the weekend, we had a 154% tariff on China. The news that has now been released is that that is going down to 30%. That's up from the current 20%. And that there are four pillars to this that China and the United States have agreed to essentially negotiate further. There's a 90-day pause. But what President Trump was just saying just a few minutes ago is that China has agreed on tariffs, non-monetary measures, subsidies, and currency manipulation. Those are the four areas that the United States is looking at when conducting its negotiations. Now, I am not saying that I think there's going to be resolution for all four of those matters, but those are the four matters that the United States now anticipates to negotiate with China over the next few months. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent gave a lengthy interview this morning on Bloomberg Television. He's making the rounds, so you can also see the very similar thing on CNBC, even though for the microphones I'm not supposed to say that. But in that interview, Secretary Bessent essentially said is, look, we essentially want to rebalance our relationship with China. We're not looking for a decoupling, but there are two ways that we can go ahead and rebalance that. One is to increase consumption on the Chinese side. The second is to decrease consumption on the American side. And he said the magic solution is somewhere in the middle. So I do think that these tariffs are going to remain as where they are for the next 90 days. He also said in that interview that you should look at Liberation Day tariffs and that the 154% became what it did is because of the retaliatory nature of the Chinese response, and that is why the tariffs went as high as 154%. But he said, and I'm quoting here, or I'm paraphrasing here, that if investors had followed his lead on Liberation Day, you would have saw that the Chinese ultimate tariff would be around 30%. Now, he also said that this 10% is a floor, not a ceiling. He also, so it begins to think that, we're heading to this situation where, based off of the UK-US deal from last week, even though the United Kingdom had a trade surplus with the United States, it's beginning to sound like the ultimate end game here is a 10% tariff plus non-monetary or non-tariff measures such as exemptions, like in the UK perspective, it was technology and automobiles. In the China example, Secretary Bessent said that he also wanted to do a strategic decoupling of certain items, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals. We'll see what additional negotiations over fentanyl bring, but it begins to actually see like this is sort of the blueprint that the Trump administration is using towards tariff policy. Now, I think that's good news for the individuals in the market. Obviously, we've seen a response from the markets overnight, but it is somewhat bad news for House Republicans. And this is where I'm going with the second portion of this call is the House reconciliation effort. Now, we're going to see the House Energy and Commerce Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee and the House Ag Committee, amongst a few others, do their markups for these reconciliation efforts. Now, this is the effort, and remember to extend the Trump era tax cuts, which would cost approximately $5 trillion to $5.3 trillion. Now, the House Energy and Commerce Committee released their text last night. I have a summary that I can actually send it to you if you'd like. Otherwise, it's available on the web. But it essentially lists out from the energy and commerce perspective two things that we in the investment space care about. One is Medicaid cuts. Now, I'm not going to talk at length about Medicaid cuts because if you want, call me and I'll facilitate a discussion with our colleague Dwayne Wright. He's our healthcare policy analyst. He can talk to you in much more length about the Medicaid cuts. But I go back to this idea that Medicaid is going to be extremely difficult to cut. And if you see that there is language in here about changing things like FMAP and so forth like that, even that is going to struggle. Second thing is the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, in the House Energy and Commerce, they list out a lot of the programs like the Greenhouse Gas Fund and all these other types of programs and grants and so forth, the carrot side of the IRA, if you will, that they're aiming to cut. This is not the tax portion of the IRA. This is the carrot, so grants, loans, and so forth like that. There's a lot of the IRA that they want to cut in here. But I would also just remind folks, and this is why I even had this conversation with a client just a few minutes ago, that this is the kitchen sink. This is what the committees are throwing in, and they're throwing everything that they can in here, including things that we do not think are going to ultimately pass the Senate parliamentarian. Because if you remember, under reconciliation, you have to pay for it, which is, look, Congress can figure out how to pay for it. Or B, it can't be things that bypass or break what is known as the Byrd Rule. It has to impact the budget. And so there's a lot of language in here that I think would not fly with the Byrd Rule. The Senate parliamentarian is one that ultimately rules on that. And yes, the Senate can get rid of the Senate parliamentarian and get a new one in there. We ultimately think, though, for a lot of this stuff, the Senate parliamentarian would just rule and say, this, you can't do this. We're still going through this line by line, so we'll have a little bit more out later this week, but that's the House Energy and Commerce portion of it. The House Ag portion of it is coming down to SNAP benefits. There's also some Farm Bill language in there. I think the Farm Bill language would actually break the Byrd Rule, so I'm going to focus on the SNAP benefits. But they're looking to cut 230 billion from SNAP benefits. It's not going to fly with the Senate. We've talked about it before. I don't see them coming up to it. So the problem with all of this is that this plus some additional language from over the weekend in terms of scoring this is that this is going to cost over $5 trillion. And President Trump, through his tariff negotiations, just took away a big chunk of how Republicans are going to pay for it. Because if the tariff on China, for example, is no longer at 154%, it's going down to 30, and for the rest of the world, it's going down to 10%, that is not going to bring in anywhere close to the $2 trillion that the House Republicans were hoping that they were going to get from tariffs, ending up how to pay for this $5 trillion bill. So yes, you will get some economic growth portion of it, and then you will get some cuts, but ultimately there's a math problem here with this bill. Now, that's not the House's issue. The House can just essentially pass whatever it wants. That is an issue for the Senate. So I think what's going to happen is that later today, you are going to see language, probably the actual text from the House Ways and Means Committee. This is all the tax portion of the bill. So if you're interested in the municipal exemption, if you've been following with Eric Kazatsky and his stuff, if you're talking about Andrew Silverman and the SALT deduction, or if you're talking to Rob Barnett and the Inflation Reduction Act, solar 45Z, 45X tax credits, this is where it's going to come out this afternoon. So if you have calls, if you have questions, contact us this week. We'll certainly get this in touch with you, or we'll get in touch with you and we'll talk about that. But they're going to meet later today. In fact, the SALT caucus is meeting with Speaker Johnson. They started about 8 minutes ago. The general feeling on SALT is that the opening salvo right now is 30,000. It doesn't sound like the SALT caucus is really on board with that, so maybe they'll get a little bit higher. But you're going to start to see the leaks coming out to the reporters probably in the next hour or so on that. And then the tax language will either be out this afternoon, and then we'll have a lot more in-depth analysis for you later this week and then beginning of next week. So let me go ahead and make sure. Let me go to the chat real quick. Anything on energy deregulation in public lands? Actually, it's a great point. So that is something that Ari Knott, our Bloomberg News energy correspondent, was reporting about earlier. Is, when it comes to energy deregulation, that's not going to fall into this reconciliation bucket. The president largely has the power to deregulate. In the energy space, they've already done a lot of that. But the sale of public lands is something that's in this reconciliation bill, and it is something that they're trying to do to essentially increase the price tag or allow you to pay for that. I have heard some resistance, though, amongst some Republicans to the sale of public lands. Specifically, it depends on the land that they're talking about. So to the client that asked that, feel free. I can talk to you offline about this. I can send you some additional reading for your information. But that one is not going to be as easy as other things, I should point out, just because I have heard some resistance to that. I'd also just say is, remember, there's going to be resistance to all this in two forms. The first form is, ultimately, we think this is going to increase the deficit. And there are going to be House Republicans that are not going to be on board with increasing the deficit. I think President Trump will ultimately be able to use the bully pulpit to get those House Republicans on board. The second thing is, though, is when it comes to the Senate, because the House is going to send whatever it wants to the Senate. Senate is going to say, thank you very much, and they're going to throw it over their shoulder, and they're going to send whatever they want back. But there has been some rumblings, and I'll just say that these are rumblings, these are rumors, these are gossip. There have been rumblings that maybe they can't do the permanent portion of the tax extension. That if the price tag is just too much, we're talking plus $5 trillion at this point, and you just took out the tariff portion of it, there's been discussions about maybe not making this permanent, maybe making this 4 years, putting this into the next administration, and daring the next Congress to not increase taxes. It's also been discussed, and this is, I don't think this is going to happen, but I just want to say out there have been some moderate Republicans that rumored have been saying, you know what, why should we even do a reconciliation bill? If we don't get what we want, let's just let the entire thing falter. And then at the end of the year, we'll work with the Democrats to come up with a solution to extend the tax cuts and just be done with that. Again, I don't think that's going to happen. I think they will get a deal much before that. But I would just say is that keep that in mind. That's what some of the rumors that's been going on. I would also just note that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said last week that August is now the new X date. This actually bodes well for the Republican Party because if you put it in the August recess, that does two things. One, it forces them to get a deal before they go to the beach, which Congress always loves to do. You know, I've always said before, if you ever want to see something happen in Washington, wait right before Labor Day, right before Memorial Day, right before Thanksgiving. As soon as Washington's about to go somewhere, that's usually when things get done. But then secondly, it does give Congress more time to actually continue to negotiate into June and into July. And then if they haven't had a deal, they'll stick through the first part of August recess. But I do think that if the debt ceiling is still included, they'll be able to get it done. If for some reason they can't get close, they're nowhere near close on this tax deal, they can always strip the debt ceiling out, but then it would force them to make a deal with the Democrats. So that's what's going on with tariffs. That's what's going on with reconciliation. The markup starts tomorrow for the House Ways and Means Committee and House Energy Committee. They start tomorrow. I think one's at 10, one's at 2. But again, you're going to see lots of headlines. And obviously, if you have any questions, just feel free to reach out. A couple other things, just real quick. President Trump, as we're speaking, is doing an executive order on drug prices. This is essentially would, I think if anybody saw his Truth Social post, he essentially said we're going to lower drug prices in the United States. I was talking with my colleague, Dwayne Wright. He sits right over here. He's putting out some notes on this. So if you want to talk about that, I'll just defer you to him on that. After he signs this executive order, President Trump is going to jam up all the traffic here in Washington, go out to Andrews Air Force Base, and then fly over to the Middle East for a 4-day trip to Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar. I think some people may have seen the news about President Trump accepting a 747 from the Qatar. I would just note that that hasn't actually been confirmed. But then more importantly to us in the investment community, it sounds like the White House is hoping to secure a $600 billion investment from Saudi Arabia. I think President Trump would like that to be $1 trillion, but generally speaking, I think it's $600 billion. And the UAE is potentially around $1.4 trillion in terms of investment over the next 10 years. Just finally, the last two couple of things is that we saw Governor Bowman from the Federal Reserve and Jonathan Gold, the nominee to be the comptroller of the currency. They got their Senate banking votes last week. We're anticipating that their vote is going to come fairly shortly. I would note that when Paul Atkins, the chairman of the SEC, had his timing, it was 6 days between the Senate bank vote and the full Senate vote. So that would put us towards the end of this week and beginning of next week. And so, you know, regulatory leadership obviously can start being put in place. And then finally, on the crypto portion of it, last week we saw a stablecoin bill fail to get cloture. This is the Genius Act. We've talked about this before on this call. The Democrats ultimately pulled their support at the last minute. It wasn't exactly the last minute. It was like a couple days in advance because they still had some issues over anti-money laundering and bank secrecy. But I would just note is both parties have said they're continuing to negotiate. And to me, that doesn't actually seem like things are breaking down all that much. I think Senator Thune had said that he wanted to schedule another vote at the tail end of this week. That may be too quick, but I've always said that I think the stablecoin bill can pass in the May through July timeframe. So I'm still at a 70% chance. I don't think that's going to change all that much. But again, it's a hiccup. I don't think anybody in the crypto space really wanted to have this hiccup occur. But again, these things do happen. So I'll pause there. Are there any other questions that we can answer? If not, please put them in the chat or into the Q&A bucket. But if not, I want to say thank you very much for your time. We really appreciate it and wish you a great week.